right, in this video we'll be finding out 4 of the ships that were associated with the Covenanters. In some cases they tried to get to the New World through their own means, and in some cases they were jailed and put there into slave ships. These are 4 examples that are listed in the Reformation.info. So let's look at this. The flow of Scottish migrants to the province of Ulster who came in search of land and religious freedom was significant in the plantation of Ireland. Yet in a short space of 20 years there was a change in the relationships with the government in Dublin, particularly after 1633, when Thomas Wentworth, later Earl of Stafford, became the Lord Deputy in Ireland, and when Archbishop Laud enforced the bishop's rule and implemented many Catholic practices in the established Anglican Church of Ireland. Scots had tried hard to fit in at the start, but friction was continuing in Scotland with the resentment to the religious policies of James I, James VI of Scotland, and his successor Charles I. So James I and James VI of Scotland, I believe, was the one responsible for bringing in the King James Bible. But he himself was a Roman Catholic, and so the King James Bible onlyists, do you know that you're supporting a Roman Catholic? Just find that interesting, you know. Anyway, and you know, there's Masonic links to it as well. There was also the fervour of evangelical groups, especially the Covenanters, that added friction to the Presbyterian communities in both Scotland and Ulster. The thoughts of a few turned to the possibility of joining the exodus to Massachusetts, but whether the impetus came from Scotland, it was early 1630, there had been discussions about migration, or from Ulster is uncertain. A group of planters and the Presbyterian minister John Livingston, Robert Blair, Robert Cunningham agreed in 1634 to seek information from Massachusetts settlers about the prospect of acquiring land and the freedoms they desired. Letters were sent to John Winthrop, the governor, and seemingly encouraging replies were received as some planter families prepared to leave for the colonies. So the name of the ship, Eagle's Wing. Into the scenario came John Winthrop, the son of the governor, who had been to Trinity College. He returned to England in 1635 to purchase livestock to be sent to the colony. It's known to have visited Scotland, where he had contact with Provost John Stuart in Ayr. The Stuarts, of course, were a sort of a royal line known in Scotland. David Dickinson in Irvine, James Murray also linked with that in Edinburgh. And Ulster, one of his contacts was affluent settler Sir John Clotworthy. The Clotworthy family had prospered under James I, and among other things had been granted the licence to sell wine and spirits in most of the county of Antrim and County Down. Very Christian thing to do. It is likely that their wealth supported the planned migration. Sir John wrote to Wentworth that a ship had been built and he was anxious that the migrant party should get underway as soon as possible, as he feared action would be taken to prevent future migration. The ship Eagle Wing came from Exodus chapter 14, verse 4. Okay, so the building of the ship got underway off the shore of Belfast. Same places the Titanic was built, infamous Titanic. Okay, let's see how they fare. Autumn of 1636, before it was ready, 150 tons of Eagle Wing was barely big enough for 140 passengers who had gathered together to face the dangers of the seas in this small craft, probably no more than about 100 feet long. Probably that would be exaggerating it. Who knows? It's round about that size. Although stoutly built, the Eagle's wing was untried and rough seas that it was to encounter following its departure from Carrickfergus on September 9th, 1636. Difficult winds drove the ship into Loch Ryan almost before it had cleared the harbour, but the length set sail once more, encountered more problems, turbulent seas, hurricanes, and, well, eventually, once the ship has actually been broken up, they decide that it's not God's will for them to leave, and they return to Ireland. November the 3rd, the ship arrived back in Belfast. John Livingstone's recollections were of quite horrendous conditions, with an imminent danger of capsizing. I mean, wow, that's just a huge failure. I suspect maybe something to do with selling of liquor, financing that project. Maybe it just didn't please God, Maybe there's other reasons. The Scottish passengers returned home, and the Ulster Scots, having previously sold their possessions, sought with difficulty to pick up the threads of their former life. There was no further attempt to make the trip to New England, as they called it. The embarrassment of failure was felt by the ministers, no doubt, and they were subject of some scathing criticism, their faith not being answerable to their zeal, as Bishop of Derry wrote to the persecutor, Archbishop Laud. So the failure of the expedition also meant that these strong-willed Scots were able to bring their influence to bear in subsequent events in Scotland. Amongst these were John Livingstone, Robert Blair, a minister of Calvinist leanings. I mean, it's another reason the ship didn't leave. It's interesting, isn't it? Well, preordained not to leave Ireland, who was largely responsible for a revival of the Presbyterian Church in County Antrim and County Down. They and others, such as Robert Cunningham, ministers of Holywood, eventually fled to Scotland to escape the persecution of Strafford. Meant that these staunch supporters of Presbyterianism were present to add their respected voices to the National Covenant of 1638. There was, however, a sweet revenge in many ways, as Sir John Clotworthy was to play a part in the impeachment of the Earl of Strafford, who was subsequently executed at the Tower of London in 1641. So this is when, the Protestant influence began to take hold in Britain. It was God's plan to eventually make Roman Catholicism illegal in Britain, which did happen. And this is what happened during the Reformation. But I'm by no means saying that the Protestant movement was perfect and wholly biblical. But these people, like, for example, the early people who believed in predestination, the Calvinists, really they got that idea from sort of, it's God's will for, a country to be under his word, that type of thing. So they had a sense of destiny, they had a sense of purpose, and it really gave them a sense that God had ordained them for these reasons. And so that, the whole doctrine of Calvinism is very complex, but it gave, I'm sure it probably gave them a sort of an encouragement during that time, because Europe was all Catholic, and they needed something from outside the natural realm, outside their natural way of thinking, in order to give them encouragement to do the will of God. And eventually, it was God's will, because it happened. That Catholicism was banned in Britain. But yes, with all the imperfections of Bible-based Protestantism. So the next ship is called the Crown, the second of the Covenanting ships in this tale to set out with the Covenanters aboard was the Crown. In Scotland, there was increasing dissent, and Covenanting fervour was bloodily persecuted, especially in the years from 1679 to 89, and in the killing time were so many executed or shot out of hand during the space of about a couple of years. Following the Battle of Bothwell Bridge on June the 22nd, 1679, 1,200 prisoners were taken and incarcerated in makeshift open-air prison next to Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh. And some of you may have read The Tale of Greyfriars Bobby, one of the most touching folk tales that you'll ever hear. It's really touching. I recommend you to read about that, Greyfriars Bobby. It's about one of the Covenanters' dog, and he went faithfully to meet his master every day. Really, really great story. Of these prisoners, 257 erstwhile ringleaders and ministers were sentenced to be transported to the West Indies or Virginia. So can you imagine, you're going out preaching the Word of God, you're telling people to repent and turn to the Bible, turn to the Son of God, and then just being jailed in a graveyard. So it was surrounded by soldiers, the space of several 100 yards, but you get literally almost, well over 1,000 people crammed into that space in a graveyard without food or water for months. And can you imagine that? Well, that's what happened. And they were actually sold as white slaves. So the white slave trade was already well in effect, during 1680s. Already well in effect during that time. So they'd just be sold as, just like the state doesn't want them. In communist Russia, you become a non-person if you don't conform to their ways of religion. So they just ship you off to the gulags. In this case, they shipped you off as a white slave to the West Indies or Virginia. The vessel set sail on November 27, 1679, but within days was forced by bad weather into Orkney port of Deer Sound, where, despite local advice, she set out once more into deep swells of the Atlantic Ocean. The ship had hardly cleared land when she struck rocks off Deerness and was wrecked. And in some cases, I've read other articles about ships, and they say that this was actually done deliberately. Let's read on. It is said that the captain was a heartless and cruel man, and despite the pleas of the frightened prisoners, he ordered and Hatch to be chained. Thus it was on December 10th, 1679, that 211 Covenanters went to a watery grave. The crew escaped by cutting down a mast and using it as a bridge to the shore, but prisoners who tried to do the same were forced back into the foaming sea. A mere 49 Covenanters survived the wreck, only to be transported again later. Possibly a similar thing may have happened to them, who knows. There is a slight problem with the numbers, as the cloud of witnesses, the main source of information, lists 49 survivors, thus 208 perished, assuming the 257 total was right in the first place. There was at least one late attempt to save one of the prisoners, and some relatives volunteered to take the place of others. A magnificent granite memorial stands at Deerness commemorating the sad event. Yeah, very nice. Okay, next ship. The Rising Sun was a vessel of 60 guns captained by James Gibson, whose brother William was a merchant and baillie in Glasgow. 27th of May 1684. An act was passed by the council granting prisoners to William Gibson for transportation to America, probably Carolina, a favourite destination. On the 19th of June, a report was made to the council by Sir William Patterson that 22 prisoners were to be removed from Glasgow Tolbooth. That Tolbooth, by the way, is still there. and it's kind of been refurbished. So maybe they're refurbishing it so they can put new prisoners in. Who knows? As far as can be ascertained, their crime was the usual, refusing to recognize the king's supremacy, and that would not renounce the Covenanters. And so, if you've not heard of the Covenanters, their cry was no king but Christ Jesus. No king but Christ. They would not recognize another king on this earth but Jesus Christ, Yeshua. 21 of their number subscribed to a joint testimony and are named by Woodrow as. And so you can see some of the names. I'll let you read them. And these are very common names. The Rising Sun was one of the ships that took settlers to the ill-fated Darien expedition in Panama. When the settlement broke up, the Rising Sun set off homeward and had reached the Gulf of Florida, where she was smashed up in a violent storm that took away the masts. The crew struggled for 10 days with a jury rig before reaching Charleston, where she lay at anchor, pending her guns being removed so that the vessel could get over the bar. But a hurricane struck on the 3rd of September 1700. The ship and all her crew were lost. Among the crew lost was young Hugh Lister, son of Thomas Lister, minister of Aberdour. It is reported that Captain Gibson was an extremely cruel person. Their daily water ration was a muchkin, less than a pint, and so it was probably just like a cup, like a mug's worth. If you get a mug, that's probably about what all the water they got every day. And an ounce and a quarter of salt of beef. It is difficult to conceive of such pettiness, but someone had to measure the rations and cut up and weigh a tiny meat allocation each day, and to do so meticulously, else they joined the prisoners. That Gibson and his ship was lost can be seen as a just reward for the cruelty towards his fellow men. So these men would have been probably very weak and pretty much dying anyway. So again, the captains that were allocated these jobs to take prisoners, they would be captains that would be rejected by the mainstream at that time. The militaries at that time, the navies at that time. These captains would have just been rejected by them and probably just given these type of jobs, which they probably hated. Henry and Francis, name of the next ship. It was a practice to commit dissenters who refused to take an oath of allegiance or recognize the king's authority to be imprisoned, but there was so many that a policy involved whereby Covenanters could migrate to the American colonies. If, however, they were convicted, they were sent as slaves. The Laird of Pitlochry, John Scott, was allowed by a warrant dated the 10th of March 1685 to select a party of about 100 prisoners to take them with him to New Jersey. He was required to land the party in America before September 1686. For this purpose, Scott chartered a 350-ton ship armed with 20 cannons called the Henry and Francis, captained by Richard Hutton. So it's my perception this ship looks as if it's the biggest, most solid ship that we've seen yet. Pitlochry visited the prisoners of Edinburgh, Glasgow and Stirling, and also Dunnottar. They all have been Christians, all of them. From where he selected about 30 prisoners. Among these was Patrick Walker, a well-known author also known as Patrick the Peddler, who managed to escape while the ship was hove to in Leith. This list is from a mixture of sources and there are one or two name variations. There were other migrants who were required to pay £5 passage money, but they could alternatively be indentured servants for 4 years, after which they would receive 25 acres of land. So this is a little bit, okay, this is a little bit more biblical, isn't it? If you're serving, and for a certain amount of time, you get something at the end of it. That's pretty cool. That's pretty good. The ship set sail on September 5th, 1685 from Leith and made landfall at Perth Amboy, New Jersey in December. It was a traumatic journey, with the ship suffering leaks, shortage of food and water, as well as fever, especially among Dunnottar prisoners who were already much weakened by their imprisonment. Of the 125 souls on that ship they set out, some 31 of their number died, including Scott and his wife. During the voyage, Scott's son-in-law, named John Johnson, had urged the prisoners to accept a 4-year servitude so that the costs of the venture could be recovered, which the prisoners resisted. That must have been pretty bad conditions, They must have been really starving and just... The ship's master wanted to sail for Jamaica or Virginia, since a better price would be obtained in either place for the prisoners. Perhaps it was Providence intervening for these Covenanters, but a change of wind forced the ship into New Jersey as originally planned. The arrival of the prisoners was not apparently welcomed by the residents, and it was left to people further inland, thought to be Woodridge, to extend the hand of friendship. The prisoners were given clothing, sustenance, and taken in. In the new year, Johnston, a mercenary man, sought to recover the costs of the exercise in the courts, which could have resulted in the imprisonment and probable slavery of the ex-prisoners. They were, however, cleared of charges by a jury because they had not come voluntarily or had they entered into any agreements. Thus the fortunate survivors went their ways, scattered throughout Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, succeeding where their earlier compatriots had failed. Hallelujah. Okay, so that's just 4 examples of different ships that left Scotland, or the British Isles, for the New World. So I hope this has given you some insight into the Reformation, how Protestantism came about in Britain, and the struggles they faced with their Catholic superiors, their Catholic authorities at that time, until the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, which during that time we're reading out, it was going through political and religious turmoil at that time, but it did settle down after the 1700s. Okay, God bless you.